Climate change is an immense problem for the whole global community. Within the global community, no countries have greater interests in finding a satisfactory solution to the problem than China and Australia, and both have large contributions to make in finding that solution. For the world as a whole, unmitigated climate change is coming faster than we'd hoped and faster than a simple reading of the IPCC and other standard scientific reports would suggest. And one reason for this is that global economic growth, the energy intensity of that growth and the emissions intensity of energy use have all been growing much faster in the early 21st century than had been anticipated in the earlier scientific work. The strong economic growth in China, India, Indonesia and other major developing countries is making a big contribution to this. And these countries are at a stage of development where energy is used intensively as the economy grows, and it happens that in the three big developing countries, coal is the most readily available and cheapest energy source. Coal, of course, is also the most emissions intensive of all the energy sources. So strong economic growth in the early 21st century is a wonderful thing for the world. It's the reason why so far this century more people have been coming out of poverty more quickly than ever in world history. But it's got a downside, the downside being the strong growth in emissions and the bringing forward of dates when we can worry about, or when we need to worry about, dangerous climate change. So this is the context in which China and Australia have to come to grips with their policies on climate change. Australia and China share very great vulnerability to climate change. In Australia's case, we've got a continent that's already hot and dry. Agriculture and other human activities are conducted with levels of precipitation and temperatures that are already at the top of the band in which humans have adapted to climatic conditions. Further warming, and as the climate model suggests that we may have to accept with unmitigated climate change, considerable drying of the southern half of the continent, a lot of Australian agriculture would be at risk, and many other aspects of Australian life would be made greatly more difficult. In China's case, the impact of climate change will be felt strongly through several channels. Chinese scientists have made many Chinese aware of China's special vulnerability to the shrinkage of the glaciated areas of the Tibetan Plateau, which could make considerably less stable the flow of water in the great rivers of China, the Yangtze and the Yellow River, which have their origins in the Tibetan Plateau. Rising sea levels associated with climate change will be greatly damaging to the Chinese economy, because so much of modern economic capacity is built on the river deltas and the lowlands in the coastal provinces, the cities all the way around the coast, from Guangzhou, Ningbo, Shanghai, the coastal cities of Shandong, of Tianjin, and others. So China has a special vulnerability in the location of a lot of its modern economic capacity in these low-lying areas. Chinese are very much aware that the drying of the North China Plain, which has already been a considerable challenge, could be exacerbated by climate change. So in all of these ways, Australia and China would be affected more than most countries on Earth. We share a particular interest in the vulnerability of other countries in our neighbourhood. Countries in Southeast Asia and the South Pacific are especially vulnerable to climate change. developing countries without a lot of capacity for easy adaptation, like China itself, a lot of modern cities and ports in low-lying areas, very vulnerable to increases in sea levels. And the climate model suggests that agriculture in tropical areas could be affected particularly severely, amongst other things, because the warming is expected to be greater in the tropical latitudes than in others. Instability or a failure of economic growth in Southeast Asia and the South Pacific would be felt by China and Australia, particularly because our neighbours would be involved. Both China and Australia have a distinctive place in the task of mitigating the growth in emissions to reducing the problem of climate change itself. Australia has the dubious distinction of being the country with the highest per capita emissions amongst all of the developed countries. There are good reasons for this. We're very well endowed with fossil fuels, and we've built our economy around that endowment. And our high incomes, our sparsely distributed populations have meant that without special mitigation measures, our per capita emissions are particularly high. China doesn't have such high per capita emissions, but its total emissions are the largest in the world and are growing faster than any other country in the world. China's emissions a few years ago were around 18% of the world total, and the work that I did in my review suggests that by 2030 China will account for something over 30% of global emissions, and in the meantime account for a very high proportion of the growth in global emissions. So there's not going to be a global solution unless China plays a major role in mitigation, and unless Australia and the other developed countries who, like Australia, use fossil fuels with great intensity, and these are especially the United States and Canada, unless these developed countries take major measures to reduce the links between emissions and economic activity, then there's not going to be a global solution. China and Australia sharing this interest in having the problem dealt with and sharing this these special characteristics as high per capita and absolute emitters are in a position where they can contribute ideas to developing a global solution to the problem. There's no global solution that's going to work unless it's seen as being fair and acceptable to all of the countries of the world, at least for all of the substantial economies of the world. And to be fair, to be seen as being fair, it's going to have to be consistent with continued rapid economic growth in the developing countries. It's not reasonable for countries who already enjoy high living standards to expect governments in developing countries to sacrifice the growth of future incomes of their people, even for such a good cause as mitigation of global climate change. The world as a whole has to find a solution that's consistent with continued rapid economic growth in the developing countries, including China. I put a lot of effort into thinking through that issue, coming up with a solution that would be seen as being fair in the developing countries, including in China, in my report to the Australian government, which was given to the Australian Prime Minister at the end of September last year. I came to the view, after a great deal of thought and a great deal of discussion with my friends who are officials and scholars in such developing countries as China especially, but also Indonesia, India, Papua New Guinea, that the only basis for allocating global emissions entitlements that would be widely seen as being fair would be one that was based in the end on equal per capita entitlements. Now at the moment emissions are hugely unequal. when Americans or Australians point to China having the highest emissions in the world, Chinese always quickly and fairly say back that our per capita emissions are only about a fifth of yours, and they see per capita emissions as more relevant than absolute levels of countries' emissions. Well, I think that that's a very fair perspective, and certainly it's a perspective that has to be respected in any global solution that's going to be lasting and effective. For this reason, I built my proposals around the idea that a global solution will have to be based on working towards equal per capita entitlements at some time in the future.